Good morning, everyone, and good evening to those joining us from Kabul, Islamabad, and other parts of the world. I'm Nilofar Sakhi, Director of Policy and Diplomacy at McColm Company, moderating today's panel titled Negotiating Peace in Afghanistan, A Way Forward. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished panelists for joining us today and all audience who have tuned in for this webinar. But historically, peacemaking in Afghanistan has been challenging for a number of reasons. Sophisticated internal political maneuvering has led to divides over what issues are considered to be in the country's national interest. Externally, regional and international powers have long had conflicting interest regarding war and peace in Afghanistan. The recent Afghan peace process, beginning in September 2018, has generated much national and international momentum for peace in Afghanistan. The peace process is categorized in a number of phases. The signing of an agreement between the United States and the Taliban on February of 2020 is considered the first phase of the process that opened door for an intra-Afghan negotiations. The beginning of intra-Afghan negotiations, marked in September 12, 2020, is the second phase of the process that's ongoing. And some believe that the process should have a third phase to deal with the regional interest and complications. The focus of this webinar will be on where things stand with peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan on the heels of intra-Afghan negotiations begin on September 12th. How and if the obstacles can be overcome, and what the impact of the United States election could be on all this. To explore all these issues, we have with us four distinguished panelists who are policy practitioners and scholars involved in Afghanistan peace and security issues and see the situation from up front. First, I will invite each of them to offer their introductory remarks, and then I'll pose some questions, including some pre-screened questions that come in via Twitter and email. By the way, a note for the audience, if there are any questions during the webinar, please send them via question and answer box. Please note that the webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the McColm Company website. With due delay, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Ambassador Omar Samad. Ambassador Samad is a former Afghan diplomat with postings in Northern America and Europe. He's a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was senior Central Asia fellow at New America Foundation and senior Afghan expert at the United States Institute of Peace. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nilofar Sakhi. Thank you to you, and thank you to the McColm Company. Great to be here with other distinguished guests and experts on Afghanistan and the region. Let me just start by saying that, as you mentioned in your introduction, it's been 2 years, right, since the Afghan peace process started. And it's been 2 weeks since the intra-Afghan part of it kicked off in Doha, Qatar. So it's already been a long journey of sorts. And I expect it to be even a longer journey going ahead with the intra-Afghan piece of this whole process. But let me just spend a minute or so laying the groundwork on how did we reach September 2018? What obviously happened before? Many of you know the first attempts to broker peace or to start a peace process in Afghanistan took place right after 9/11, actually. And the Taliban were reluctant, and the Taliban did not want to engage the United States and others in trying to find a solution to the Al-Qaeda problem. So that meant that they were left out of the Bonn process in November, December of 2001. And some people and observers say that the fact that the Taliban were left out of the Bonn process back then may have impacted the next 20 years till today. If we had found a way to incorporate the Taliban, maybe we wouldn't have had a war. We would not have had so many casualties and losses and destruction and engagement. But it's part of history now. It took another 19 years for us to reach a point where the Taliban would sit at a table with others and discuss issues. Now, we all know what happened throughout these 19 years or so. It started out first as a counterterrorism mission. It still is a counterterrorism mission, but it obviously took on new dimensions over time. It also became somewhat of a nation-building, state-building enterprise. And I remember those first days in Kabul, because I was there the first 3-4 years before my first assignment. And the discussions were not about, in a big NATO footprint. They were not about a big US footprint. They were not about hundreds of billions of dollars of expenditure in Afghanistan. It evolved over time and developed into such a endeavor. But at the beginning, we were all thinking that within the first 2-3 years, more or less, we would no longer have a need for foreign presence in Afghanistan. We would have a need for foreign assistance for Afghanistan, and maybe some security assistance, obviously, to rebuild the Afghan army and police and security forces. But nothing of the sort that we saw happen thereafter. So, we went through surges, different occasions. We went through attempts at reducing the footprint, and then again increasing the footprint, and it became a very costly endeavor in my viewpoint. Costly not in terms just of resources, but also many lives, Afghans and non-Afghans. And we saw that the Taliban re-emerged from their hideouts, in Pakistan, but also from Afghan villages. And over time, Afghan villages continued to play a role in feeding the Taliban insurgency because of a mixture of corruption by the government, of mismanagement, of bad governance, of injustice, and of, I would say, targeted attacks that not only aimed at eliminating armed resistance and armed insurgents, but also caused collateral damage, unfortunately. And the more collateral damage you saw, the more reactions also followed inside the country, and also was fed from outside the country. And I'm not trying to minimize the impact of outside. So we reached a point where around 2008, 2009, we were a bit more serious about talks and about finding a solution. By 2012, the Taliban had opened an office in Qatar. There were attempts at kicking off intra-Afghan talks. There were protocol and sensitive political issues that came up and prevented that from happening. And then it took, again, a few more years for that to happen. Now, with, I think that with President Obama, you saw some errors that were made in terms of, for example, not having a very consistent policy on one hand, and you are going to leave by a certain date, or that the mission is going to change. So things that should not have happened, that were politically not correct, did happen. But then with President Trump coming into office, we first saw an attempt at basically destroying the insurgency. So there was again another surge, not very publicized, but there was a surge that ended with that mother of all bombs being dropped, and trying to break the insurgencies back by 2018 or so. So between 2016 and 18, the military option was carried out again. And by September of 2018, I think that the administration realized, and the American establishment overall realized that this war is not going to be won. So that was a major turning point. The turning point where you realize that you need a political solution, that there's no military solution to this war. And if you pursue a military solution, that you may end up in a quagmire. And so to avoid a quagmire, I think that this mission, this peace mission, through Ambassador Khalilzad started. And it spent most of its time talking to the Taliban and figuring out each other and getting to know each other. And I hope one day somebody's going to write a book about this, but I'm sure that it's fascinating to see how it started and how it reached the point of a deal, which many criticize for a lot of reasons. But after all, it is the first deal that happened. It has maybe some shortcomings, but it actually laid the groundwork for the intra-Afghan peace, as you mentioned, to kick off. Now, there are a couple of other pieces to this whole puzzle that still need to be worked out, including the fact that the Taliban have certain commitments that they have to adhere to in terms of counterterrorism. And then obviously there is the whole issue of ceasefire and the issue of how the Afghans are going to agree to a shared future, to power sharing of some sort or another. And there are all kinds of views about this right now. One side saying you have to join me, the other side saying we have to create something new. And so there are a lot of intricacies and there's a lot of politics involved. And for the past 2 weeks, we have seen this group in Doha trying to at least come up with the initial layout of the groundwork for talks. They haven't addressed content, or they haven't addressed any of the issues that will come up. They're just trying to sort out the procedures for talks. And that in itself has proven to be complicated. And as you know, there are a couple of issues that remain unresolved. One has to do with the fact that the Taliban insists that the talks, the negotiations need to be interpreted according to a certain Islamic jurisprudence, the Hanafi school. And this has nothing to do with the future of the government or the state. This has to do with the talks themselves, because there's a lot of confusion about this. And the other issue that has become problematic is the fact that the Taliban, again, are asking that the US-Talib agreement of February 2020 be considered and be recognized and be accepted as a base and as a framework for the rest of the talks that take place. And that in itself, obviously, is politicized and has implications that can be controversial. So I will stop here, if you don't mind, and then I'm sure that we will have time to pursue this further. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Certainly, we'll get back to the details and nit and grits of all this Doha talks and the procedural arrangement talks that's happening. I'll get back to you about that. Our next panelist, Dr. Jonathan Schroden, is CNA's Center for Stability and Development Director. Dr. Schroden also directs CNA's Special Operation Programs. He has deployed several times to Afghanistan. Dr. Jonathan has served as a strategic advisor to the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, beside many other deployments that he had around the globe. Dr. Schroden, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, the chance to both share my thoughts, but also to hear from the other panelists who are much more distinguished individuals than I am. So it's great to be among them. I was asked to address the security situation and the possibility of a ceasefire as part of the talk. So I'll address those two things in turn. So on the security situation, let me start by saying there is this perception, I think, among many people who sort of watch what's happening in Afghanistan, that the situation is a stalemate, right? That the government and the Taliban are effectively deadlocked against each other. And I would say that that's not an accurate depiction of what's happening. And I think it's based on a few, really three false assumptions that I'll talk about in turn. So the first is there's this belief that the government cannot militarily defeat the Taliban, and the Taliban cannot militarily overthrow the government, and therefore, hence, you have a stalemate. But what I would say is these statements are only true in the context of external support to the various sides. So for example, if you took away US air support, support to the Afghan Air Force, and US and NATO support, in training, logistics, maintenance to other parts of the Afghan security forces, the Taliban would pose a much larger threat to overthrowing the government by force. Similarly, if you took away Pakistani, Russian, Iranian, Gulf state, etc., support to the Taliban, the government would have a much better chance of militarily defeating them as an organization. And so that external support on both sides is critically important to their overall capabilities and ability to do what they're trying to do. And yet, if you think about the possibility of that external support being removed, really that's only likely to happen in the case of the government, which is to say the trend line of US and international support to Afghanistan's government has been steadily declining since 2015. And the US Taliban agreement has some specific deadlines and conditions associated with it for the withdrawal of all of that, at least military support, sometime in 2021. So that's the first point I would make. The second is that people like to point out as well that the government still controls the major population centers and therefore a large fraction of the population itself in Afghanistan, while the Taliban control a good fraction of the mostly sparsely populated rural countryside. But again, I would point out this sort of belief that implies a stalemate ignores the operational model that the Taliban have been employing to try and take as much of the country as they can through military force. And that's largely what I would describe as an outside-in strategy, which is to say they use their sanctuaries, their safe havens in Pakistan to generate military power, which they project into Afghanistan to try and capture rural areas. And as they capture more and more of those rural areas, they then use them to project power into ever more populated areas. Right, and so basically it's eroding security from the rural areas towards the cities. And the Taliban have done that steadily and successfully since 2014, to the point where if you look at various maps of Taliban control or contestation of areas that are available, you can see that they've effectively surrounded about 8 to 10 of the country's cities right now. And they're increasingly able to either control or at least significantly disrupt traffic on the major roads that connect those cities as well. And so while the Taliban have agreed as part of the US Taliban agreement, in presumably these secret annexes, but these details have been made public at this point, that they've agreed not to attack in the cities or to attack US forces as part of that agreement. They do continue to just continually attack, regularly attack ANDSF, Afghan Security Force checkpoints and units in those rural areas. And they do that both to pressure the government while the talks are ongoing, but also to continually better position their forces to try and choke the cities if these talks fail. And so while the US and Afghan security forces have been doing what they can, in this sort of active defense model that the forces are postured in right now, to try and hold that back, which is to say they do a lot of airstrikes, I think many more than people are even aware of what's being reported in the news. They're doing quite a few airstrikes. They do some offensive operations, but they're fairly limited in scale and they're mostly defensive in nature, which means the best that they're able to accomplish through that model is really to forestall the Taliban capturing large swaths of additional territory, but the government is not really able to recapture any lost ground in its current stance. And so the third point I would make is that people also like to believe that Afghanistan's security forces continue to improve in capability as a result of US and NATO training and support. But I would argue at this point in time, that's really only true of the Afghan Air Force and to some degree the commandos, which is to say the Special Operations Forces. The US and NATO, at least in my view, effectively gave up on Afghanistan's police force several years ago. And so the police at this point are a terribly ineffective paramilitary overseen by a terribly corrupt Ministry of Interior. And so that's one reason you see so many police casualties happening day in and day out in Afghanistan. And it's another reason why criminality in the cities, to include Kabul, has gotten so much worse over the past 1 to 2 years or so. In addition, both the Army and the police are much smaller than they're supposed to be. So the total force, Army and police, Air Force, et cetera, is authorized to be about 350,000 people. The most recent reported number that you'll find is about 290,000. So that's a shortfall of 60,000 personnel, or about 17% of the total force size. And that's just on paper. So if you were actually able to calculate how many security force individuals are showing up on a given day, the force size would be much smaller still. Now, by way of comparison, the Taliban size is typically estimated to be in the range of 50 to 80,000 personnel. So so Afghan security forces are effectively missing a contingent roughly equal to the entire Taliban force on paper. And if you looked at who's actually showing up, it's probably more than double that in reality. And so they have this massive deficit of manpower, which both results in them not being able to control as much of the country as they might otherwise be able to, but it also results in the continued mis- and overuse of the commandos and the Air Force to try and cover areas that the Army and police can't reach. And on top of that, you have this continued high rate of turnover in the Army, which means they're effectively in just continuous development mode, right? They're constantly recruiting new people and having to train them, et cetera. They're not really professionalizing the force very much over time. So all of this is to say, the security situation in Afghanistan is emphatically not a stalemate. It's a tactically and strategically eroding situation in favor of the Taliban, and the Taliban know that. And so the implications of that for the current negotiations are that the government's position is weakening over time and the Taliban's is strengthening, which means that time is on the Taliban's side as these negotiations unfold. So that's my comment on the security situation. On the ceasefire, I'll be a little bit more brief and just say there's no question that the primary desire of the Afghan people, the government, the international community is for a comprehensive ceasefire to occur as soon as possible. That, in my view, though, that is unfortunately not likely to happen anytime soon. The Taliban have stated clearly that they won't agree to a ceasefire until a new form of national government has been agreed to. And I believe they've taken that position for two main reasons. First, because the inability of the government to secure the country and unilaterally get violence to go down undermines its legitimacy in the eyes of Afghans, right? It makes it look weak and ineffective. So violence is a primary form then of exerting pressure on the government by the Taliban during these talks. Second reason I say this is because continued fighting gives Taliban fighters something to do while the talks progress and reduces the risk of fragmentation or splintering of their organization. And this is something the Taliban have been seriously concerned about for years and have taken a lot of action to try and mitigate. So continued violence helps the Taliban both hit the government at one of its weakest points, and it helps them defend against one of their own. And so for this reason, I don't think we'll see a comprehensive ceasefire anytime soon, unfortunately. What we might see, and what I think the international community should press for in the immediate term, are some forms of limited ceasefires, akin to what we've seen over Eid holidays in the past. And I say that because the Taliban, I think, know they can't just ratchet up violence indefinitely. The international community will balk at some point at what they're doing. And the Taliban do want that, support and legitimacy from the international community. It's quite evident that that's one of the things they're pursuing. And so I think we're likely to see periodic reductions or even possibly breaks in the violence over time as the Taliban attempt to try and, engender goodwill or reduce pressure from the international community on them. But those will be temporary. And I think they'll be followed by resumptions in violence whenever the Taliban believe they need to do that or whether or not they can get away with it. And so those are my thoughts on the security situation and the possibility of a ceasefire. I apologize that none of that is very happy commentary, but that's where I see things today.
Thank you, Dr. Schroden. I certainly get back to you about the details of this violence and its impact on the talks. Our next panelist, Dr. Jennifer Brake Murtazashvili. Dr. Murtazashvili is the director of the Center for Governance and Markets and Associate Professor of International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. She is the author of Informal Order in the State in Afghanistan and Land, the State in War, Property Rights and Political Order in Afghanistan. Her research focuses on the intersection of governance reform, security, and political economy in Central Eurasia with a focus on Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. Dr. Murtazashvili, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours. You're muted.
Of course. Thank you, Dr. Sakhi, for the very kind invitation, and very grateful to McColm Company for the for organizing such a wonderful panel today. So thank you very much. It's a really distinguished group of practitioners and scholars to be here with today. So thank you very much. So there's I was asked to speak about the regional dynamics, and it's a really interesting time to be talking about the regional dynamics in Afghanistan right now, especially as it pertains to the peace process, because so much is changing with them. And if we were to, if we were to look at Afghanistan, many accusations made about Afghan politics. People are switching sides. If you look back to the Civil War, people say, oh, factions are always changing sides. You don't know who you can rely on from one day to the next, and it's so hard to keep track of politics. Well, increasingly, we're seeing the same dynamic among many of Afghanistan's regional partners. The situation is very fluid. People who were very once opposed to speaking to the Taliban and engaging with them several years ago now find themselves as some of the greatest supporters, and some of those who were very not very supportive of the Afghan state are now supporting that the government in Kabul quite enthusiastically. So we're seeing a lot of very changing dynamics in the neighborhood. But I think one very important point that Dr. Schroden brought up was about the violence that's taking place within the country. And something I'm not going to discuss, but I think that has the potential to be a huge spoiler for what's happening in terms of regional politics. And there's huge possibilities for regional diplomacy right now to have a very positive effect on what's happening inside of Afghanistan, is for this violence to really ratchet up and for many of the neighbors to become more concerned than they are about what's happening. If we see this violence continue to escalate, you may see some of the, Afghanistan's neighbors become more concerned and put more pressure on the government in Kabul to come to a very quick negotiated settlement, or maybe even withdraw support for the government, full stop. This is something that concerns me, and I think it's actually of enormous concern to many Afghans who are suffering from this violence on a daily basis. And the violence is getting bad. It's getting very, very bad. It's been bad for a long time, but seeing the escalation over the past several weeks has been quite troubling. So what may not affect these outcomes regionally or globally is the American elections. I think this is sort of a big question mark. It does seem that the Afghan government, to some extent, is sort of dragging its heels, as the expression says, because maybe they things will change for the new administration, if there is a new administration in Washington. I think this is yet to be seen. I'm so far outside the Beltway that I can't tell you what the Biden team is saying about their position on the Intra-Afghan talks. They're obviously supportive of them, but the question of military withdrawal is a different question altogether. But we don't see any strong reason why we would expect a drastic change from one administration to the next in terms of the U.S. position. Something to keep in mind about the role of the United States inside of Afghanistan. We know that democracies are not particularly good at state building because of the myopic nature of political leaders who tend not to want to, who don't have the ability to commit to something in the long term because they're always seeking re-election. That's why Afghanistan has suffered from so many of these cycles of uncertainty about the role of the United States in the country. And that's gone on for the past 12 years or so. There's been so much uncertainty about what role the United States can have. So it's difficult for outside powers to hedge a lot of bets. But what we are seeing in terms of regional dynamics is really two camps unfolding. Those who are sort of very supportive of the regional dialogue and participating in the intra-Afghan talks, and those who are not. So those who are not is Russia, India, and Iran, and they have been the least supportive of the peace process, at least in public. Iran and India have been the most vocal about their opposition to the creation of a potential emirate inside of Afghanistan, right? And that's one of the big issues that's been on the table, is will the future government of Afghanistan be a republic as it currently is, or will it revert to being an emirate as it was under the Taliban. It's a really interesting development. Russia is also has not been very supportive of the peace, the intra-Afghan dialogue. They were not in Doha when the talks kicked off. This is it's a really interesting development to see, you know, Iran and Russia now becoming very reliable partners of the Ghani government. This is sort of a remarkable turnaround, I think, in many ways, if you consider the fact that, you know, the U.S. was once considered the most reliable partner of the government in Kabul, and for many in Kabul, that is really up in the question. That is sort of an open question about who is the most reliable partner externally for the government. Many of these countries, Pakistan, Iran, and to some extent Russia, are also criticizing what they believe to be a hasty troop withdrawal. I mean, Iran not so publicly, but you can see that there's real fear about potential U.S. takeover, Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and continuing violence. So this to me is a very interesting development, because if you were to tell me several years ago that this alignment were to take shape along these talks, it would be quite surprising to hear that Iran, who has for so long sort of advocated for the withdrawal of the troops, you know, Khalilzad made a very interesting remark last week, saying that he says that he believes that Iran wants the U.S. to remain in Afghanistan, not for peaceful purposes, but to protect its own security interests, right? Because it fears this growing you know, Sunni alliance or the growth of ISIS or things like that, but also to keep the U.S. entangled in a conflict. And so I think in the case of Iran, both things can be true, that Iran does want the United States maybe to maintain some kind of presence inside of Afghanistan, not withdraw too hastily, but also for its own protection, but also because it entangled the United States in a prolonged conflict. So other countries to keep an eye on, of course, is China, and China's relationship with Afghanistan is particularly interesting. You know, Afghanistan has not participated in the Belt and Road Initiative, although neighboring countries such as Pakistan, Tajikistan have been quite active partners. I think China has not been as afraid of engaging with the Taliban or as tepid about it. They had relations before, you know, even when the Taliban was a government in Kabul. But I think one of the concerns that's really driving China more than Belt and Road and economic interests is, of course, if we look at what's happening inside of China in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, and there is this fear of what they perceive to be the extremism and violent extremism spilling over into China, not necessarily from within the borders of Afghanistan, but because they have seen Afghanistan and Pakistan become sort of this training ground for militants. So China is happy to see this conflict come to an end. They want to see a stable Afghanistan, both economically, because the country provides a really important corridor for many of the trade opportunities. And I just want to say a final word about some of the Central Asian countries, because they often don't get enough attention, and it's one of the areas that I work on most. A really positive change that we've seen over the past 3 or 4 years has been complete 360, 180 it is, that Uzbekistan has taken towards its southern neighbor, Afghanistan. This has been really surprising, because for many, many years, under the government of Islam Karimov, he viewed Uzbekistan, Afghanistan as a threat. This was a source of terrorism. It was something that had to be contained. There was like a great wall of China on the Amu Darya dividing these two countries. When Karimov died in 2016, President Mirziyoyev came to power, and he initiated a vast array of political reforms, both internally and externally. And this involved better relations with all neighbors, including Afghanistan. And Uzbekistan has played a really important role in the peace negotiations. They've hosted talks in Samarkand. And, you know, although it's a small country, having a country on the border with Afghanistan that could be a potential new friend, new trading partner, new source of, you know, economic dynamism, I think is something that we could consider to be a very optimistic turn. Uzbekistan is very interested in developing trade and commerce and developing those corridors southward and developing many of those energy projects and electricity projects that we have seen stalled for many years. This could really provide an economic boom for the country, for both countries, and provide sort of new corridors. So there's things to be optimistic about. It's a really interesting, dynamic situation, hard to keep track of because the positions of the countries seem to be changing very quickly. And from, Russia very early on was participating, was hosting talks with the Taliban, and now with the intra-Afghan dialogue, they seem to have had a sort of an about face, and they're not participating in the process at all. Can they be a spoiler? I'm not so sure about that. Can any one country be a spoiler about that? I think maybe there's one strong possibility that we might hear about next from Dr. Khan, but I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murtazashvili, for your comments. I'll certainly get back to you about the details. Our next panelist, Dr. Ijaz Khan. Dr. Khan is a visiting faculty at the School of Politics and International Relations at Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, Pakistan. He's the author of numerous publications. His latest contribution is a book titled Pakistan's Strategic Culture and Foreign Policy Making, a study of Pakistan's post-9/11 Afghan policy change. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me and providing this opportunity to share my views and learn as well from other speakers. In brief time, I'll be sharing my views on Pakistan's role in the Afghan peace process. Now, in the current phase, which I consider to be the third phase of the whole process, the first being the US-Taliban negotiation and the deal, and the second being the process between the deal and the commencement of the intra-Afghan dialogue earlier this month in Doha. Now, to understand Pakistan's role, understand what's Pakistan's Afghan policy, what are its interests, and Pakistan's relations with Taliban. Now, if we look at just a few days back, 2 or 3 days back, Mr. Imran Khan, Prime Minister of Pakistan, wrote an op-ed in Washington Post, and if one deciphers that, Pakistan's role and policy becomes clearer in the whole process. Pakistan's Afghan policy and objectives there are determined mainly by two factors. Of course, there are other factors, but mainly by two factors in the context of its relations with USA, China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Now, the two factors, one is threat perception from India, and the second is the issue of Durand Line. Durand Line is the line that divides Pakistan and Afghanistan, and which has traditionally, continuously been refused, has not been accepted by Afghanistan. Even Taliban government there did not recognize it. Now, these two are almost taken together because with India's presence in Afghanistan, Pakistan considers the significance of the Durand Line issue increases. That also Durand Line issue brings in picture Pashtun politics because Pashtuns are on both sides of the Durand Line. And that India and Pashtun national politics brings in Pakistan's attitude towards religious forces and religious extremists because it's preferred partners in Afghanistan. Because it considers that religious, especially extremist religious forces will find it difficult, if not totally impossible, to be closer, to align themselves with a Hindu India against a Muslim Pakistan. So it considers that to be their better bet. The second issue is Pakistan's role to understand is how much influence do they, what is their relationship. Now, unlike presented by many, both Pakistan's who are critical of Pakistan's role or even supporters, they exaggerate the influence of Pakistan for the Pakistan, definitely Taliban and Afghanistan have a clear-cut connection. This has been even acknowledged by Imran Khan in his recent op-ed, because Pakistan was able to bring them to the negotiating table with American tank and all this, so they acknowledged. However, this is wrong to say that Pakistan, they are somehow agents of Pakistan or working for Pakistan. In the sense that Pakistan orders and they say, yes, sir. That is not the case. They negotiate. They definitely take into account Pakistan's opinion, Pakistan's views seriously, with respect, consider them, accepts them totally, partially, and there are instances where they may not agree. However, Pakistan can definitely influence. Pakistan's role in the whole process, as well as in the current process, is to use its influence, whatever. First was to bring them to the negotiating table, they came. Then to pressure, to force them or to convince them for a compromise. As much as the United States role there is to convince, to use its influence on the Afghan government, other side, negotiated settlement. However, when Pakistan plays that role, Pakistan, like Americans, others, is and would be looking out for its interests and its policies in the final deal as well, as clear in Mr. Khan's op-ed as well. But when he refers to the regional external spoilers, regional spoilers, he, without naming, is referring to India mainly. Because it considered Indian presence and Pakistan's considered has been awfully repeated. It's not new that whatever the deal, Indian presence must be minimum, with zero military to military relations between India and Afghanistan. Plus, it would expect the new dispensation, whatever comes, to recognize Durand line. And if they find it difficult to recognize, at least not give it much significance in their policy, in their relations. Now, all this role is playing in its attempt to play a balance between its relations with the United States as well as China. And it addresses so when I say the relationship with Taliban is good, but it's not absolute. Pakistan would want a negotiation, not a total government, absolute government of Taliban, but a Taliban dominant government. Because it considers Taliban dominant government will not be giving for a religious person, ethnic-based identity is of less importance. So the land issue will be of less significance. And also, this will mean continued dependence of Taliban, need of Taliban to listen to Pakistan. So it would want. And then this would also mean there's a total, absolute return of Taliban. That would mean religious extremism and its impact on Pakistan also is religious extremism. And not just the Americans and the Chinese all would not want that. Xinjiang was mentioned earlier by Dr. Jen. And definitely that is an important thing. Pakistan would be looking at that as well. So a mix is what Pakistan is looking toward in Afghanistan. And that's what Pakistan is facilitating. Pakistan has been doing that, bringing them. Now currently Dr. Abdullah being in Islamabad on the first leg of his regional tour. He's going to India as well as China next. And they are trying to reach out Pakistan to give the impression, the perception that it is not against this or against them. And once, in addition to that, the new thing is, which Imran again referred to in his article, the regional connectivity, and that without mentioning CPEC, but that is also part of it. But in that, it wants to bring in United States as well. So Pakistan would want to use this opportunity to become much better appreciated in the US considerations of its policy towards the region. And with that being, because if it is better considered, it will not be, also again, India is at the back of Pakistan's mind. It will not be totally given up in favor of India, because the India-US relations are increasingly improving, and especially with the India-China context happening. So I think Pakistan is trying to facilitate a broad-based government, dominated definitely with a stronger role for Taliban, and such a peaceful outcome will be in the interest of Pakistan, and that let's see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. I'll get back to you about the details of the relationships. All right, getting back to Ambassador Samad, you highlighted in your talks about the procedural arrangement which is happening right now in Doha, and that seems to be a major discussion between the two parties, the Republic and the Taliban. It seems it's going beyond that. I mean, you highlighted that there are two issues coming up out of this procedural issues or procedural talks on rules and regulation. The first one, you said, it's about, they're talking about framing a relation between the US-Taliban deal, and also they are also discussing theological basis for the political settlement. There are two major issues that's coming up out of this procedural talks. Do you think it's still procedural talks? It seems it's more of the substantive talk which is coming up right now, and it's the core of the ideologies that these parties are talking about to frame the basis or a guiding principle for a political settlement. So how do you see the prospects of these talks, the ongoing talks, and how the ideological differences between the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the Taliban could play a role in moving forward, especially looking at the current level of talks, which is kind of moving beyond the procedural and touching more of the ideological issues between the parties?
Yeah, thank you. I was pointing to two contentious issues, two issues that have yet to be resolved in the context of many other issues, as you mentioned, that are part of these so-called procedural talks. These procedural talks are supposed to pave the way for substantive talks and pave the way for setting an agenda. So we're not even at the agenda level yet. They are not. To me, you know, I don't know to what extent at this point ideology plays a role. I think that over time we will see more and more issues that have to do with worldviews of the two sides emerge. And when the worldviews of the two sides emerge, ideology will be one factor that will be used. And especially, you do know that the Taliban base everything on their interpretation of Sharia, of Islamic law. And they base everything on how they read and interpret not only sacred texts and manuscripts, but also what, for example, the Prophet says, the Sunnah, and so they have had for 25 years at least amongst themselves come to some kind of understanding of how society should be organized, how the role of politics is to be, what is the role of the citizens. They don't call them citizens, obviously, but the followers or the disciples or the ummah or the people who live in an Islamic society. So they see everything from that perspective. And so you have, obviously, at the very beginning, a clash of two worldviews, because those who represent the Republic, as you say, or this post-2001 political order, are themselves not fully united on about what they want. They represent, obviously, a wider range of constituencies in Afghanistan, whereas the Taliban represent a much more centralized community of Afghans. Some of them living in Afghanistan, some of them living in refugee camps, for example. But the Republic side, or the side that Kabul represents in the Doha talks, obviously, is a total different representation. And they don't have, unfortunately, the kind of unity or consensus that people like myself expected them to work on for the last 2 years. They missed, I think, an opportunity to build a strong consensus. There are still many differences of opinion in Kabul, which is fine in a so-called democratic setting. You have differences of opinion. But when you go to talk about the future of your country, and when you go and talk about possibly a future political order and power sharing, and maybe a new constitution, and the role of citizens redefined or at least discussed, you have to be on the same page. And so we have the Taliban who look to be on the same page, maybe, and we're not sure to what extent they are, but they look like they are. And we have a Kabul team that talks about, republic, constitution, human rights, women's rights. But then when you get to the nitty-gritty of stuff, they have their own differences of views. Now, how do you bring all of this together? I think that the approach of having procedures and agreeing to some procedures are fine. But yes, when you interject ideology, and if you interject policy, and if you interject issues that have to do with future discussions on agenda and agenda items at this stage, it can disrupt it. Now, I want to go back to a very important, in my view, item in all of this, and that has to do with not just what is happening on a daily basis in Doha, but what is the political will behind peace or war? Who are those who actually really believe in a peaceful settlement, which means that then you have to be ready to compromise and to be flexible and to argue your case and to offer solutions. So if that political will is weak or non-existent or is actually a distraction or used for other reasons, then obviously you're going to have problems. We need to find out exactly what political motivation drives the Taliban, and we need to find out what political motivations drives this team that represents Kabul. And it doesn't even represent all of Kabul or all of the rest of Afghanistan. It only represents those that the palace feels comfortable with, and maybe parts of the Afghan political elites feel comfortable with. It's not a full-fledged, empowered team to discuss very important issues, and we will see how they will deal with that. Whereas on the Taliban side, you have more coherence at some level, and you have the experience of the past 2 years of negotiating with the Americans. And occasionally here around the Beltway, you hear from Americans who have been involved the fact that the Taliban are very hard-nosed negotiators. They are extremely difficult to deal with, but at the same time, they have their own sense of reality too. And it comes back to what others mentioned earlier. It will come back and boil down to the fact that who is going to be seen as stronger or weaker inside the country, politically and militarily. So the Taliban obviously know how to play this game. They are keeping their military options open. They are using every means possible to exert pressure and make sure that they are seen as the stronger party, whereas the government is trying its best. It has a lot of challenges, as Dr. Schroden alluded to. They have challenges that they have to deal with. And so at the end of the day, I think that it's really not what exactly happens in Doha, which is very important, or maybe later on in some other capital, if the talks do not break down totally. But what really is happening inside the country on the battlefield, as well as control of territory and population centers, and how public opinion can be shaped. Because right now, from what I see and hear, public opinion in Afghanistan is not only uncertain about the future and not only worried about the future, but it's also starting to ask new questions about whether they want to agree to some kind of compromise that may have to give up on some rights in return for peace and stability, versus fight it out to see who wins at the end of the day, and in the process lose thousands of more people, and with prospects that look bleak. Because at the end of the day, if it's the Taliban who are going to win this war, then not only are you not going to accomplish your goals, but you're going to lose all those rights, even if they are partial rights. So there are a lot of things going on, and I am keeping my eye very open on what is happening on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Just to add to your point, I want to continue with Dr. Schroden on this. You highlighted that Taliban are politically strong, and they're talking from the position of strength. And Dr. Schroden, you mentioned that Taliban are strong on the battlefield, and they are obviously talking from the position of power. So you and both of you are kind of, your case is actually the Taliban, based on the facts and based on data that you have highlighted, you are saying actually that they have more leverage at the table of negotiations right now. So, I mean, moving forward, when one party at the negotiation table is talking or negotiating from the position of power and position of strength, how optimist or how actually you see and assess, Dr. Schroden, the future of these talks? You know, how compromising the negotiation table would be in light of the strength that you and Ambassador Samad highlighted?
Yeah, it's a very good question. You know, as I said earlier, I think the time is really on the Taliban side, at least given the current dynamics that exist on the battlefield and in the security situation. And so the longer these talks drag on, I tend to think the worse the deal is going to be for the Afghan government, right? In part because the battlefield, again, assuming that current dynamics continue, which I have no reason to believe otherwise at this point, will continue to sort of favor the Taliban's hand and strengthen the Taliban's hand. I think the international community will grow increasingly impatient with these talks the longer they drag on as well. And so you're likely to see, I think, especially on the US side, increased pressure on the Afghan government to make greater concessions the longer these drag on as well. And in addition to that, to echo Ambassador Samad's point, the Taliban, again, the folks that I've spoken to who were involved in the US Taliban negotiations made similar observations to what the ambassador said, which is they are very shrewd negotiators, the Taliban. They stake maximalist positions on all of the things that they care about, and they don't move very far off of those positions. So even when they make a compromise, it is, you know, to move not very far from where they started and to exact a much larger compromise on the other side in return for that. And so again, I sort of see the longer these drag on, the worse the deal, the worse the outcome is going to be for the Afghan government. And so if you're asking me, you know, what do I think the Afghan government could do to try and reverse those trends or try and give itself a stronger hand? I think some of the things Ambassador Samad mentioned are absolutely important in terms of strengthening their negotiating team, its consensus, you know, identifying very clearly what are they willing to trade away, what are they not willing to trade away, what are the red lines, right? What is their negotiating strategy? It's not clear that they have a well-formulated strategy, or at least a comprehensive and coherent one among their team. So that's one thing. On the battlefield dynamics, I think there are some things that they could do to try and you know, stop this eroding tactical and strategic situation. And there I would offer three. One is they really need to recruit more people into their security forces. As I said, they're missing at least 60,000 positions, even on paper. And the salaries are there for those positions to be paid. I mean, the U.S. budgets for, you know, a force of 350,000 people and would be willing to pay salaries up to that level. So, you know, a surge, a real focus on recruiting and trying to get more men and women into the Afghan security forces to bolster their ranks I think would be really worthwhile and something that they could relatively easily do in the short term. In addition to that, I would suggest that they need to, invest a lot more in the quality of the checkpoints and various tactical positions that the Afghan security forces have staked out. Part of the reason the Afghan security forces suffer so many casualties is because they have very poorly defended, poorly set up checkpoints and tactical positions in many areas. Now, the U.S. has traditionally not been willing to advise them on how to improve those, because the U.S. Army, which has been largely in charge in Afghanistan, has a differing view, which is that checkpoints are not a useful operational model, that instead they should be doing large-scale unit operations to go on the offensive in the way that the U.S. Army would operate. I've disagreed with that operational model for years. I think the Afghan Army is much more suited to a wide area security model that employs large numbers of tactical checkpoints, but they have to be set up in the right way. And so one of the things they could do is to try, given that they are ineffectively in an active defense model now, which leverages that type of setup, right? Like lots of tactical checkpoints. One thing they could spend a lot of energy on that would be helpful is to make those as defensible as possible. And they could ask for the US's help on that. And in fact, when General Miller became the commander of Operation Resolute Support, he came in with a different view because he's not a conventional Army officer like the past commanders have been. And so he did early on in his tenure spend quite a bit of time on this issue, trying to improve their tactical position, the defensibility of their checkpoints, et cetera. The COVID environment, though, absolutely wrecked any efforts to try and continue doing that, because U.S. forces are just not allowed to go out nearly as much, if at all, to do those types of things. So that's the second thing they could do. And then a third thing, just quickly, although it would not be a quick process, but it's a quick mention, would be police reform. They really, really need to do a lot internally to reform their police force, to move it away from being an ineffective paramilitary to a democratic style policing force in the cities, and some form of provincial police force in the rural areas that would have a bit more capability to defend itself than a democratic inner city type police force. And what's interesting is there is a lot of support that would be available to the Afghan government from the international community to engage in those types of reforms, were they willing to undertake them. Between EU police, Interpol, there are a host of international policing organizations that would be willing to step in and help them if they would ask for it, and frankly, if they could get the US to agree to step out of the dominant role that it has had with respect to Afghanistan's police force for the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, thank you. So it's kind of the measurement plan or the recommendations that you kind of put forward. Now, I mean, violence is too high right now, and all of you mentioned that it's both Afghan government and Taliban using it as a means to shape the negotiations. That's clearly indicated. So there are a number of case studies. There are a number of studies actually around the concept of ceasefire, whether ceasefire push the momentum or keep the momentum of intra-party talks, or whether it freezes the talks. There are two actually concepts about the ceasefire. Where do you see, if I come to you, Dr. Murtazashvili, if you answer this question, how do you see the level of violence? Does violence undermine the peace process actually, or no? It's kind of it's speeding up, because both parties are trying to push their points at the table, talking from the position of power, and they want to make something, they want to bring something up. So what are your take on this? How do you see this level of violence, the surge in violence, and how it has its impact on the talks, on the ongoing talks?
Right, so we have to understand incentives. What are the incentives here, right? And so, in certain situations, the incentives might drive towards quick resolution. In other cases, that might not be the case. But look at the incentives of the three major players here. One is the United States. So we're calling these peace negotiations, and yes, indeed, they are intra-Afghan peace talks, but they're really driven by the desire of the United States to get out of Afghanistan. So the US has very short time horizons here. And that's why I asked the question, the next administration, what will if there is a change, right, of administrations in Washington, will there be a change with regard to Afghanistan? I'm not certain that there will be a change. So that's one thing that's driving incentives. Number two, if the US continues this pace of withdrawal, it puts a lot of pressure on the government, on the Ghani government, to make a lot of concessions that it may not be willing to make. I think I read something today that what President Ghani said, that like he will not leave the palace alive, like there will not be a change of government, on his watch, that this government has to stay. These are quite strong statements coming at a time when the government really seems to be losing more control over the countryside. So, a lot of people have said, one of the great successes of Afghanistan over the past 15 years is that the government in Kabul has sort of remained intact. But yes, Kabul remains intact, but the degree to which the government controls so much, yes, it controls the large cities and population centers, but that could be under great duress. So I think the short answer to your question is it gives the Taliban an enormous amount of leverage when neighbors want to see stability. And the increased violence, I think, gives the Taliban an enormous leverage over the outcome, given the fact that this is not just a peace process. This is a peace process that's taking place over the fact that, given the background that the U.S. wants to get out.
Thank you. Ambassador Samad,
may I interject something on ceasefire and violence?
Sure,
just to follow up on what both my friends said. You see, I don't think we should expect or even push for a comprehensive ceasefire to be accepted by the Taliban at this stage. The Taliban know very well, like other insurgencies around the world have used the same concept, actually, and the same tactic in the past. They know very well that there will come a point when they will have to do a trade-off for a big political incentive. So unfortunately, the use of violence will have to end up with some kind of political incentive that is not in the picture right now, because that would probably mean an interim transitional period that would be accepted by all sides in return for a comprehensive ceasefire. Now, having said this, we in all sides, including Taliban, have I think an incentive to reduce violence. And so we need to do everything possible, either come up with short-term, temporary truces, either we do regional truce in one place to another, we do, for example, civilian-targeted, soft target truces. So we need to come up with a formula that all sides can agree that safeguards civilians first and foremost. And I think that the discussions, even in Doha and in Kabul and other capitals, is shifting towards a reduction in violence focused on civilians. And I think that would be a confidence-building measure that needs to be taken seriously into account.
Thank you, Ambassador Samad. I'll get back to you about the reduction in violence because there are certainly a number of measurement issues related to reduction in violence. I'll get back to you on that. Dr. Khan, you discuss about some positive developments currently happening between the two countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, with a recent statement by Prime Minister Khan and Dr. Abdullah's visit to Islamabad and Pakistan's foreign minister's statement and emphasizement on creating bilateral relations between the two countries. They all seem to be positive moves so far between the two countries. Now, the question comes about Pakistan's strategic support to the Taliban and how the relationship between Pakistan and Taliban will evolve during this process, or if it will evolve, actually. how do you see that relationship by moving forward, and how the impact or the outcome of the talks impact this relationship, the relationship between the Taliban and Pakistan, and overall, how do you analyze this dynamics, the relationship dynamics between the Taliban and Pakistan by moving forward during these talks and even afterwards?
All relationships are dynamic. They move, they evolve, they become better, they get worse. I mean, their relations with, even if there is a stronger and weaker partner or equal partner, the United States-Pakistan relations have gotten almost to the breaking point and then again become together. All these things happen. So Taliban-Pakistan relations definitely are evolving, always being impacted, improving, not improving, will depend on how the talks progress, how developments inside Afghanistan, what happens. I think at the moment, the relations are good, I would say, are okay, they are accepted. However, you see, the problem is Taliban have gained a perception. Earlier it was referred, they are very tough negotiators and they don't move an inch, even a little. They have not, because you see, up till now, if you look at the whole process of negotiation from day one, whatever they have asked, I mean, even that US Taliban is much more to their, what they say, demand than to the Americans. The Americans, the guarantees that Afghan territory will not be used for international terrorism is something. Can someone ever cite me any statement from Taliban that even when they were in government or out of it, that they had said Afghanistan is being permitted or is being used for international terrorism? I mean, when Osama was asked, they said, okay, we will try him or give it, that will come later. Give us proof of it. He was not involved. They denied that at Harvard. They have stuck to that position. Anyway, I will not go into that detail, but Taliban from day one, they did not want to talk. Then when the deal happened on intra-Afghan dialogue, 5,000 was the figure mentioned, and they did not sit for talks even with one less than 5,000 being released. And the pressure was on Afghan government because US was publicly imposed, telling them to be accepted. And that even when the intra-Afghan dialogue, Mr. Pompeo gave a statement that if deal is not reached, we will end all support, all financial aid to Afghanistan. Now Taliban are not receiving any aid from the Americans. It is the Afghan government who will suffer if aid ends. And it was referred to also the Americans are giving, and everyone, whether they appreciate American role, whether they appreciate Afghan government, Taliban or not, they agree that the United States just want to leave. Better if there is an agreement, but even if not, they will leave. And there is an agreement on that between both Joe Biden and Trump. They want to leave on that day. How they leave is the question. So this strengthens Taliban resolve to stick it out. Not to compromise. Why should they compromise? There is no compulsion. Pakistan definitely would want it to compromise a little, at least to accommodate other views. Like I earlier said, it would not want a return of a total control, old Taliban extremist government in Afghanistan and its next door to it. It is for its own sake, as well as, I think, Chinese influence, as well as the United States and West as well, where it wants to improve its relations. So Pakistan. So that thing, if Pakistan tries to push them, how much Pakistan can push them is the issue. And then if with this confidence that Taliban has gained, the ability of Pakistan to push them, pressurize them has also decreased in that sense. So how much, if they push them more than enough, certain level, that may, I mean, the relations is not not exactly very good. Anyway, there are people among Taliban at lower level, mid-level, low level, who are not very happy with Pakistan's role because it was at times cooperating with the Americans, at times not cooperating, things like that, their inability to freely move around in Pakistan, all these things, the restrictions were there. So that will increase. So Pakistan would be trying that. How much it can do, we have yet to see. The issue is Afghanistan, which everyone is ignoring. Personally, I think there's another aspect I just want to add besides your question. In Afghanistan, I think a lot of things have happened in the past 20 years, even before. We are only analyzing Taliban and the Afghan government and the warlords and these things. I think we should not exaggerate that, but a very strong civil society has emerged. The women voices are much stronger today than ever. And even outside that, there are people that have come. Afghans have, for the first time in the past 10, 15 years, have seen election rallies. See, there were jirgas. People used to sit and talk. But election rallies, contesting election, making speeches, that is a new thing. Whatever the level of quality of that, rigged election, bad election, corruption, but election process, go convince people. People raising slogans, debating. That was not the way things were done. So this is a new political culture happening, and that will impact all sides as well, the negotiations. The deal, the future is not just what they agree or not agree in Doha. They are, I think, influencing Taliban as well as non-Taliban. How much, that has to be seen yet. It's not yet clear the level. I don't want to exaggerate their role. They're not, but they are there. Their voices, and everyone at least refers to them. So how much that will have an impact on the final outcome. Pakistan will be there, like I earlier said, don't want to repeat them for that, but it will keep in mind its relations with China, United States of America, and Taliban Afghanistan. So it will pursuing its policy in that context. It wants to regain that US relationship as well and maintain definitely continuously with Chinese. So with an extremist Taliban, total control, Taliban control Afghanistan, I think would not just annoy, Americans may not care about this, they're too far away, they're giving up. Chinese would be more worried about that. So that will, so how they proceed is the question. Well, things are open at the moment. There are stalemate, but I think inviting and Imran Khan probably is planning a visit to Kabul. That is also giving a signal that it's sort of trying to give the perception that we want to be independent, not be seen on one side. How much that is taken up the message there, that has to be seen to understand the final impact and the level of impact.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Yeah, there are also a lot about the ad hoc meetings between Pakistan and Afghanistan officials, plus US Special Envoy and Pakistan representative. But these meetings haven't produced any agreement yet. So it's kind of, it seems everything is lip service at this stage. No, I mean, commitments by words, not by documentation. So that's an important element to keep in mind by moving forward, that this meeting should produce a substantive agreement about the peace in Afghanistan. That is most of the scholars and practitioners talking about the third phase of the peace process, that the regional actors and regional stakeholders should sign agreements by moving forward or implementation of that peace accord, whatever will be in place, that many are talking about the third phase of the peace process. So with that, I would like to pose the last questions to all our distinguished panelists. I'll start with Dr. Murtazashvili. How will a US drawdown of US troops and the potential outcome of the intra-Afghan talks influence regional actors going forward? You kind of highlight a little bit in your talks. If you can, conclude your remarks by answering this question, Dr. Murtazashvili. Thank you so much.
it gives the withdrawal of the U.S. troops obviously creates, I wouldn't say a vacuum, because these kinds of realignments are already taking shape in the region, and that's why you see these sort of very different positions taken by regional actors. Pakistan is changing its tune. Iran is changing its tune because they understand that the reality of what a Taliban government will look like, and I think that's the big question. And I think it's a question that we still don't know the answer to, is what would a government that involved the Taliban look like? And we're seeing a really unfortunate series, I think, of missteps in my mind from the government in Kabul, just an unwillingness. It's not only dealing with the insurgency, but it's also dealing with a very divided government internally. And this is creating an inability to compromise on certain political issues, many things that have, as a result of the election, certain reforms that could have taken shape that would have given, I think, the Ghani government a much stronger position to deal with the Taliban. So it looks like it really also depends on how the Ghani government reacts to this withdrawal and what will happen to the armed forces. So I think that in terms of the regional players, you're going to see this continued reassertion, but looking at Russia in particular, China as well, and Pakistan and Iran, and we're seeing very different outcomes and not certainty about how many of these countries will actually deal with the Taliban if they do assert themselves.
Thank you very much. Dr. Schroden, how do you see the impact of US elections on the ongoing talks or overall peace process in Afghanistan? You provided such a savvy analysis of the security, and you provide some recommendations also for security arrangements to move forward. But how do you see all this will be implemented or operationalized with another event coming up under the title of US elections?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there are some mixed views on this. So my own view is that I don't see that much daylight between a second Trump administration and a Biden administration when it comes to Afghanistan policy. I think both men have made it clear that they would like to get out of Afghanistan as soon as they can, in order to try and focus on any number of other global priorities that have become far more important, frankly, to the United States than what's happening in Afghanistan these days. The difference between the difference in the two men themselves would be the nature under which they would leave, right? I mean, if Trump had his way, we would just up and pull out, I think, and leave, tomorrow or very quickly. Biden has stated publicly that he's much more interested in the possibility of leaving behind some small U.S. Special Operations Force presence to continue to conduct counterterrorism operations, something that the Taliban have said absolutely not, that they are, steadfastly against that, at least until some type of alternative government is put in place and has a chance to have its say on that. But that said, if you look more broadly at the foreign policy establishment, the advisors that are around these two men, and sort of what they say about things, I don't think you don't see that much difference between the two sides and their views on the future of Afghanistan policy, which is to say, quickly, there's wide agreement that the number one priority for the U.S. is protection of its own security interests, which is to deal with the likes of Al Qaeda and ISIS. And so that there's broad consensus on that. I think that is the number one priority, and that's really what the U.S. needs to stay focused on. There is some degree of consensus that things like, the nature of the government, whether it's democratic, republic, or some other form of government, is important, but perhaps not critical to the United States. Women's rights are important, but I don't think I wouldn't put them, on not personally, but my view is I don't think they're on par with U.S. security, its primary U.S. Security interest in Afghanistan. I think there's general agreement on that point as well, which is to say not to abandon women's rights, but to try and secure them in different ways than we think about securing our core interest there, which has to do with Al Qaeda and ISIS. And there's not that much daylight between the two sides on those particular issues or how to think about approaching them. So while I agree that it does with Dr. Jen that it does seem like the government is stalling to some extent to see what happens with the US elections, I think it's actually not in their interest to do that, because the results of the US election is not going to, at least my view, not going to significantly change the US's policy with respect to Afghanistan, no matter which side wins.
Thank you. And final point from Dr. Khan in relation to pretty much the same question that that was posed before. How do you see the withdrawal of US troops and the potential outcome of the Intra-Afghan talks influence Pakistan-Afghanistan relationships going forward?
This will have impact definitely on the relations of Pakistan and US. How the result will have an impact on that. There is an agreement. There's a balance with which Americans are happy, relatively as much as they are happy, as that will improve the relationship of Pakistan with US. As much as that does not happen, it will have negative impact on that. But I think I agree with Dr. Schroden that yes, there's not much difference between, I referred to that earlier as well, between Biden and Trump, but there's slight difference. Even, you see, when what was that saying, when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches fever. So, you see, this slight difference may make a lot of difference for a small country like Pakistan. A slightly little more emphasis on women's rights, or a little more open. I mean, you see, when we talk of women's rights, don't think of United States, don't think of Norway, we're talking of Afghanistan. I mean, it's just a little thing. That is a lot. And this may make a little difference. And that is what I think, I agree with Dr. In the government sees an interest, a little window in the democratic presidency for that thing, which will, they would still want to, for a company, and there will be pressure on it, but they will feel a little less pressed than they currently do. Now, like the bank, whatever you do, sign something or we are out. Then it may be a little less than that. Coupled with that, I mean, a lot of other actors, Pakistan or inside different non-Taliban and non-government forces, different forces, actors. And there's a report today I read somewhere about talks in the Panjshir Valley of total resistance to these things. All these things will make Taliban maybe, I mean, this perception in Taliban, they won the war and they're victors in a discussion for a winner plus versus loser agreement, that may end, may be dented. And so we may have a little more balanced, a little relatively balanced agreement. Because agreement, all sides realize that they need to have some agreement. This is a serious opportunity. And at the end of the day, whoever can be blamed, rightly or wrongly, for failure of this thing would suffer inside Afghanistan. Seriously, because Afghan populations are not. And today in Pakistan, everywhere, I think, even in the most remotest backward society, these parties, whether they are holding weapons or not, public opinion matters to them. They do influence. They want to be liked by people. Even if they are Taliban or warlords or whatever, they want an approval from the people. They will be able to support, much needed a lot of things. So they would not want to be seen to be the of this opportunity. But how it goes, it has to be seen. And I don't see a total collapse. The US would not want to just leave, but in the end it may. And Pakistan also, like again, Mr. Imran in his op-ed in Washington Post has clearly said that Pakistan would not want to abandon Afghanistan like the Soviets did and left chaos.
Thank you.
There should be some sort of an agreement, because it will be a huge problem for the region and this country. If there is no agreement and they leave, it will not just be Afghanistan, in this whole region, Pakistan will be affected, Iran will be affected, and by extension India. And that means that all this region is affected, our US security interests cannot remain unaffected. They have serious interest in this region unless and until the US has decided, okay, goodbye to the whole region. So they will be doing all this for having some sort of an agreement. Let's see.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. My last question from Ambassador Samad. It's a very broad question, and I hope you will be able to articulate it in a way to set up concluding remarks for today's session. How does a broad-based, inclusive, and comprehensive political settlement look like, according to your view? How do you see that? You're muted, Ambassador.
Thank you for that last broad question. Before I touch upon that, can I just quickly go over the other questions you brought up and tell you that, from my opinion, there's one item that we still we're not aware of, which might have an impact on many decisions down the road, and that is what may be in the secret annexes of the US-Taliban deal, number one. Number two, when it comes to Biden-Trump in the US elections, there are three items to watch out for. Not just the troop numbers, which are very important, and not just the future of counterterrorism, which is very important and has to be taken into account, but also the funding stream. How much money will or will not be provided to Afghanistan? And I'm not just saying Kabul, because maybe later on it will be something that looks different than what we see today. Money and the funding stream is very important in terms of US policy going forward. On the Afghan-Pakistan relations, all I want to say is we need to look at spoilers on all sides to see how the dynamics on that will work from now on. And on the regional dynamics, I want to add some nuance to what Dr. Jen said. I think that you should look at, and this is how things are shaping up as far as Kabul is concerned, or how people are looking at it from the Afghan side. You should look at the nuances and the positions being taken here on by Iran and India on one side, each for its own purposes and reasons. And you should look at, on the other side, how Russia, Pakistan, and China are maybe working on some kind of consensus. And in the middle, you have Central Asia somewhere. And you have the US that has to balance things according to its needs. On the talks that are going on, Dr. Sakhi, I think we should expect a roller coaster from here on, a tug of war if you want, and it will very much be influenced by Kabul politics and regional politics, and of course and the US election cycle and all of that. Getting back to your question, what does a broad-based inclusive future look like? Well, it's not going to, my hope is that it's going to take into account the hopes, aspirations, and the tremendous sacrifices that the Afghan people have made over the years for what they believe in. And we need to realize that there is no one strand of belief in Afghanistan. There are different strands of belief in Afghanistan. Our value systems may be shared at some level, but at some other level, if you look at the whole of the country, not just the cities, not just the bubbles within the cities, not just Taliban controlled areas, but if you look at the whole of the country, and if you want to take into account the silent majority of Afghans and get the pulse of the country, I think that we need to seriously engage them. I think that they are not engaged enough. I think there are segments of society that are really important that are not engaged enough. I think that we always make the mistake of listening to a few Afghans who either speak very good English or very good French or something, and or a few Afghans who are connected. or a few Afghans who serve a certain purpose or another. That is a huge mistake. The Russians made that mistake. The British back in the years made that mistake. The Americans have made that mistake. The Pakistanis have made that mistake. We need to stop making those mistakes. We need to get the pulse of the country. We need to get the pulse of the region. And we need to find solutions that work for the greater good, not one particular group or particular person or one particular ethnic group or a particular constituency or lobby group. We need to stop doing that if we are going to reach a solution that works in Afghanistan. So I'm going to stop at that. And that's where you have to find inclusivity and broadness of scope that will find Afghan-led and Afghan-owned solutions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for your concluding remarks. Very insightful, all of you, and thank you so much for your participation and insightful contribution. Very substantive points came up in terms of the regional connectivity, regional prospects, which seems regional agreement could be a solution to all these dynamics at the end, and a lot that has covered by Ambassador Samad could be a leading point while moving forward with the inclusive and comprehensive political settlement. So thank you all again for your time. With that, I'll end this session, and it's recorded. It will be available on the McColm website, our session for today, the webinar, and you will have access to it for your own purposes if you want. Thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day.